Okay, all right. Well, we're going to get started. Thank you for coming to the intimate follow-up Q&A with Anderson Cooper, who will be here shortly. That's not what we're doing today, but we thought that's maybe what we should advertise so we get a good crowd in. But thanks for joining us right here after lunch for this session. So we're going to be talking about burnout and unhappiness, both from a student perspective as well as a staff perspective as it relates to mobile devices and technology and social media and things of that sort. A few just housekeeping items. We are being video recorded as part of the virtual session for NASPA, so that's why we are kind of limited in this range where we stay within the light. And we are going to have a point where we're going to ask some Q&A, so we'll probably have you ask that question. We'll repeat it on the mic so the folks watching virtually can hear it, and we'll proceed as forward. So just a little bit of kind of introductions. We decided rather than show our pictures up there, since you can see us, we picked the emoji that we think best represents us. So I am there on the right. My name is Paul Brown. I work at a technology company now called Roompact. Prior to that, I just started there about a year ago. I've worked in higher ed my whole career. So Roompact does residence life software, so I'm still doing higher ed work just for a private tech company instead of for an institution, which is like a whole nother session, in fact. And there will be one like that here later today.
And I'm the purple guy, who I think is amazingly awesome, just like me. And I'm Annie Stark. I am the Director of Residence Life at the University of Central Florida. And my dissertation focused on staff burnout and mobile technology use in that. So I'll be sharing the staff piece of things. And it's going to be a good session for us all today.
Great. All right. So in terms of objectives, we talked a little bit about we're going to take this from a student and a staff perspective. So Annie's got the staff perspective. I've got a little bit more of the student perspective. So you're going to be hearing from both of us today, but there's definitely synergies between both of ours, and we've kind of weaved some things together. But we also know that when we've done this once before, the audience was really helpful in helping us weave it together in ways that we never even anticipated in there. So we'll be able to get through a number of different objectives here. So we know that technology is important, right? Technology is everywhere in our lives. So I love this revised Maslow's hierarchy of needs that places battery life at the bottom, followed by Wi-Fi, followed by food, water, and shelter. I did not design this, although I love it. But I think it kind of gets at the point of, what's most important to us in our lives today and how key technology has really become as a part of that. And if you look particularly amongst younger folks in terms of social media and technology and mobile use, those statistics actually really run in tandem with each other. Younger folks are using it way more than their older cohorts ever are. So if you even look at social media use by age in the lower left corner there, 89%, 18 to 29. You get up to 65 years and older, it drops down to 43%. An interesting fact about some of the statistics about mobile technology use is that the only really statistically significant predictor of social media tech and mobile use is age. It is no other factor. So if you look at things divided by, let's say, race or socioeconomic status or even gender, you're actually going to find uniform usage of the technology. Now, different groups will use different technologies. So the example I like to give from the statistics I got is white women love Pinterest. They love it. If you're a white woman, you probably love Pinterest, according to the statistics. So different people in different demographic groups will situate themselves maybe differently and how they use the technology, but in terms of general access, as well as just using social media platforms, it's relatively uniform across all sorts of demographics, which is kind of interesting. People wouldn't necessarily know that. And in part of that is because of smartphones, right? That greatly lowered the barrier of access to the internet, particularly as it relates to socioeconomic status. So even students of lower SES tend to have a smartphone of some sort or some private device because they're much cheaper than they ever had been in the past. There's more complicated aspects to that. If they can only access mobile websites, are they experiencing a different internet than other people are? And we can dig into that way more. That's a whole nother session in terms of that. But I at least wanted to set the stage in terms of the ubiquity and use of the technology. So I'm going to turn it over to Annie, who's going to start us off and talk a little bit about her study as it relates to staff and their experience of burnout.
Excellent. Do I need this? All right. So like I said before, my dissertation was focused on staff, mobile technology use, and whether or not it correlated to higher rates of burnout in student affairs. And so as we look into burnout, how many in the room have ever felt burnout at some point in your career working in student affairs? Like, oh, this sucks. I'm done. I'm over it. Yeah? Yeah. So we all feel this, right? But I was curious to know, one, student affairs is missing from the literature, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but also if our mobile tech use was adding to that, specifically looking at after hours texts, phone calls, and emails, and the need to respond to those. And so the literature started with basically social workers and teachers. And so when we were looking at burnout in those occupations, it was the workload of the teacher, the workload of social worker, and the emotional connection to their work. And that was causing a higher level of burnout for those groups than compared to other groups. The study of burnout started in the mid-60s, so this is not a new concept for folks, but it definitely is rooted in social work and education. From there, they moved to police officers, and police officers took a little bit of a different twist in that also the workload of police officers, the emotional investment of police officers in their work, but additionally, this is the first time where we start to see that family work conflict come into a cause of burnout. So having to work all the time, the long hours, the stress that can come with the family and the work environment as well, which is familiar to some of our roles in student affairs as well. Then burnout seemed to move to student athletes, and it took a different twist here as well. When burnout was looked at for student athletes, it was very much focused on, the students are focused on perfectionism and high performance, which, any athletes in the room? No, am I the only one? Okay, trust me, it's true, we are perfectionists when it comes to wanting to achieve at the highest level. So I was not surprised when I read about burnout and student athletes being more driven towards the pursuit of perfectionism in their sport. And so what I used was Maslach's burnout inventory. Maslach is like the goddess of all things burnout. And so I used her survey because it's been around, tested, those types of things. Anybody looking to do a dissertation, a quantitative dissertation, use a survey instrument that's already been done, tested for validity, makes your job a whole lot easier as a student, just a tip. And in that, Maslach focuses on 6 areas of burnout. One being the workload. And so the workload is exactly as it sounds, right? The amount of work that you've got to get done in a given period of time, the extent to which your workload may take you beyond the traditional work hours. And in the survey, it asks questions such as, I do not have time to do the work that must be done. So that would be a question on the survey that would reflect a workload burnout indicator. Control is important. So do you feel control over your work? Do you feel like you have the ability to do the work that's been given to you within the way that you feel like it's best for you to do? If you don't feel like you have control over your work, then you're going to be less satisfied and more likely to lead to burnout. And one of the sample questions from the survey is that I have control over my own work. Kind of obvious. Another aspect is reward. And so do you feel like you're being appropriately rewarded for the work that you're doing? We also know that reward can come in a variety of different ways for different people. We're not all motivated by the same thing, so that reward may look differently. But the fact is that you feel like you've been rewarded for the amount of work that you're doing. If you don't feel like you're being appreciated and rewarded, then you're more likely to burn out in the workplace. Then we've got the sense of community. And so it's really important in the workplace for you to feel like you have a place where you belong, where you have at least one colleague or a couple colleagues that you can go to and rant about the day or celebrate your successes. But if you're alone and you feel like you can't connect to anyone in your workplace, that makes it a pretty unhappy place for you to be. And it can be hard to get through the day-to-day, especially when the work gets tough, and especially in our work where it can be so emotionally draining. It can take you into all kinds of hours of the night and those types of things. And also fairness. Fairness is a big piece of burnout. And so do you feel like your employer is treating you fairly? Do you feel like work is being assigned fairly? Do you feel like colleagues are being held accountable at fair standards? If you feel like there's an unbiased or there's a biased approach to holding people accountable in the workplace, you're going to be more likely to be frustrated and burn out in your workplace. And then core values. Core values are incredibly important. And we'll talk a little bit more about how important core values are a little bit later. But if your personal values don't align with your institution, that's going to make it hard for you to stick it out very long in that place. And so I gave a lot of talks to our grads, job seekers during TPE. It's really important to do that self-work to understand what your personal values are and ask really good questions in an interview process to make sure that your values align with your institutional values so that you don't burn out, so that our students can be served to the best of our ability. And like I said before, when it came to the technology use, I focused on after hours, text messages, emails, and phone calls. And what I found was there's no correlation. So it's not our technology. Our technology is not burning us out in the workplace. We're just a grouchy bunch of folks. And let me tell you, we are a grouchy bunch of folks. And I also learned that the longer you're in student affairs, the more likely you are to be cynical about the work that you do, which I thought was interesting. We can unpack that differently in a different session someday. But what did matter most are the values alignment and our control over our work. So those are the two most important pieces when it comes to student affairs work that lead to burnout if those are not done well in the workplace. So think about that as you go back to your campuses, as you do your work. Do you have control? Are your values aligned? If not, you're going to be more likely to be grouchy and not serve our students very well. And then, so what I did, yeah, if you'll help me, perfect. I have part of the survey that I brought with me today so that you can actually see how burnt out you are right now. And so Paul's handing that out. It's a short 14 questions, I believe. I did the best I could to put the scoring and everything at the bottom so that we wouldn't have to go through it as a large group, knowing that I wanted to be cognizant of time. But simple questions, and it's on a 0 to 6 scale. You mark how often. Yep, every day. Whether you experience these things on a 0 to 6 scale, never to every day. So question 1, I feel emotionally drained from my work. And you would mark 0 to 6 as to how often you feel that. You fill it out. At the bottom, there are different categories. They're lumped into different categories of professional efficacy, exhaustion, and cynicism. And those will give you your totals. And I've broken out there too. If you have high professional efficacy, that means you are less likely to burn out. If you are high on exhaustion and cynicism, you're in trouble of burning out. So it's time to engage in some conversations with supervisors, mentors, colleagues about maybe a job shift or realigning expectations, or joining Paul at RoomPact to work in a different environment alongside higher ed. But hopefully this will be a good tool for you. Feel free to take it back to your campuses and work with your staffs with this as well, if you're interested in knowing kind of where your staff is at this point in terms of burnout. Oh, great question, Paul. Thank you. If you were not able to get one today, you can email me, and I would be happy to email it to you. My email address is my name, so Annie, A-N-N-E .stark, like Iron Man, but way better, S-T-A-R-K, at ucf.edu, and I'd be happy to send you this electronically so that you can use it in that way too.
All right. So staff are not the only ones that are on duty when they're on their phones. Students are on duty as well. It's just that they have to keep up with their social media profiles and their postings and their engagements, right? So an interesting way of thinking about burnout and stress and unhappiness, which is a little bit more what you're going to see coming from the students, is they in some ways feel like they're on duty too. But they're not on duty like we may be holding a phone to respond to a crisis. They're on duty as it relates to social media and keeping up with their friends in things. And so one of the concepts in my research, which I've talked about, is this idea of digitized development. And so if you think of classic college student development theories, I tried to look at it. How do those look in digital spaces? What happens when the world that we occupy isn't just the physical one that we're in right now, but also a virtual one that has its own communities and its own rules and norms and cultures that happen. and ones that you can kind of come in and out of very quickly, which is a little bit different than when we're acting in this physical space, right? And so thinking about digitized development is kind of the underlying developmental processes that inform how we understand ourselves and our behavior in digital spaces. Digitized development can carry unique properties from offline development. That's because we can do some things online that we can't do offline, right? I can instantly communicate with my friend in New Zealand very easily right now from here that I couldn't really do in the physical world because we're so far apart. So it collapses time, space, other boundaries and things like that, and it unlocks some behaviors that we weren't previously able to do, and that has some implications, I think, for how students develop. And so part of my work is I used as kind of a base. Actually, I didn't even start with this, but I kind of fell into it as I was working with my students, is talking about self-authorship. Marsha Baxter McGold's theory, the ability to author your own lives. Probably many of you in this room are familiar with that, one of the classic developmental theories. And students' developmental patterns in their behavior online fit very well with Marsha's work, but have some twists that make it maybe a little bit different than what she may have anticipated before these things occur. Now that's a slide with a lot of small text on it, so don't worry, I'm going to read it to you. So don't worry about trying to squint to see that. But students, when they interact online, are basically moving in that classic from external definition where other people define me or help form my rules to an internal definition. This is what I believe, and I'm okay in that, even if we disagree, and how do we navigate that? And so students on the external kind of end of the spectrum, and these would be, for a traditionally aged college student, you're probably talking about a student in their first and second year. And all of my students that I interviewed basically aligned with this. They're openly exploring social media, because prior to this, in adolescence, mom or dad, a parent, a guardian, adult figure in their lives limited their access to social media. You can have a Facebook profile, you can have a phone. If you have a phone, you can be on it this number of hours. And so parental figures, as well as adults, usually kind of, curbed their or shaped their social media use. And so they also are then beholden to authorities and look to authorities to kind of say, hey, what should I be doing on this? Now, flip to that is they're externally defined, right? So what is the biggest currency for an adolescent is where you fit in the social hierarchy and what other people think about you, right? And so by and large, students then are super influenced by peers and peer culture at this stage. Should I be posting these things to be a part of a group? Things of that. Students also have a kind of a naive understanding of how online and offline worlds interact. So if I post something that's problematic online, what do you mean I can get in trouble in the offline world because of what I posted online? Because they're two separate things, right? When I started, I remember doing student conduct back when Facebook started to blow up, and students would post photos of themselves drinking in their rooms, and this still happens even a little bit today, and they'd be brought in on student conduct charges. They're like, wait, you can't go, that's online, that's private. Right? And it's not really private when it's online, per se. So students will have a naive understanding of how those things impact each other and how their actions online could lead to loss of a job or not getting a job or some of the ramifications of that. As students move more towards internal definition, then they're able to say, okay, I don't need to follow up with my peers all the time and feel validated by them. I can put stuff out on my own. And feel confident in that. So you'll see students that are adolescents or leading into college often taking a lot of selfies, wanting to get validation. Oh, you look beautiful, or you're gorgeous, or things like that. There's less of an emphasis on it. I don't think it completely goes away. It changes with our day-to-day feelings about ourselves, but by and large, it's developmentally it's going away. And so they start to decide, this is how I want social media and mobile use and technology to fit into my life. So many of them will take breaks from it, say, I'm going to give it up for Lent. Some Catholic students gave it up for Lent. Other ones said during finals, I'm going to step away from it because they want to start taking control over where does that fit in my life. Because up to this point, they just kind of ride the wave and say, oh, this is how everyone else is using it, and they get caught up kind of in that trap. And so they begin to understand, oh, as my life changes, I renegotiate where this fits into my life and why it's important to me. And so the one thing that came out loud and clear, and this is what relates to depression and happiness with students, is the like. That was, I did not seek this out when I started my research, but it was just so consistent, it suddenly became more of the core of what I was doing. And there's this idea that you need to pursue likes because that's what validates you as a person. So I had one of my participants, Addie, talking about a post. How many likes did your post get? And she says, what does that even mean? That number in itself doesn't mean anything unless you compare it to other posts. So then you start doing this thing where you're going down a route where people are comparing how many likes they're getting and then determining how much you're worth. And you're thinking about it too much. So Addie is a fourth-year student traditionally aged at a university. And she said, this is the type of behavior that I got caught up in. But if you really think about it, like, okay, I got 30 likes. Well, my friend over here, Tony, only got 20. What does that mean? That means I'm better than Tony, right? Because I got 30 and he only got 20. And that's the comparison that starts to happen, which if someone's externally defined, that can be really seductive in a not so great way. And part of this is students are putting out images of their lives that they want to have perfected. So this is not my image. This comes from an artist. You're going to see a few of these that says, here's what you see on Instagram, which is usually the perfectly composed photo, and here's all the mess that's actually going around it, that we're only getting a partial picture of what we see. Here's a cartoon that also illustrates that same point, right? The Facebook version of you is rocking out as opposed to the non-Facebook version, which is just the reality of what's actually going on in a day-to-day. So Mazout says, in the back of my mind, there's a certain standard of interaction that I get on every single tweet that I want to make sure that I don't drop below. And so not all of my students, but a majority would exhibit this kind of behavior of feeling like I have to show a certain type of life to get the type of interactions that I want. And so part of it was they didn't realize or didn't think about the fact that you're getting such a selective view of reality. So Hallie says, we use social media as a highlight reel of our lives, and how many times out of 10 would you say that you wouldn't post something because it's not a highlight? And so she's talking about this idea of we're only seeing a small sliver. And so if you're comparing your life, you're only comparing highlights in some way, shape, or form. Not the best route to go down. There's a lot of times when you think that people have the best life ever because of what they're posting, when in reality they're going through a lot and probably many similar things that you are, but because they're posting all this fun stuff, you think their lives are perfect. And so students described it as wearing outfits or different masks, or even a game was one of my students described it. It's like a dance. You can't be too much of something. So not only do you have the pressure of I've got to keep up, but then you have this dance of, well, I need to appear like I'm having a good time, but if I do it too much, people will know that I'm trying to show you that I'm having a good time, so I have to temper that back, but I still need to show you that I'm having a good time. So you can kind of get the convoluted kind of logic puzzle that you get stuck in if you're trying to do this and curate a certain image of yourself. It can become really pretty exhausting because it's like playing this game all the time. And exhausting is exactly what one of my students used to describe it. Annie says, I've got to keep up. And Logan says, it is exhausting. It's what causes my unhappiness. The comparisons get so intense, I feel like I'm a constant failure. And so Logan was a student who, in talking with him more deeply, I believe would have been a retention risk at the university. He made it through, but there were times when it would become so intense that he would be unhappy with his college experience. And what was unique about Logan in particular was of all my students that I had in my study, he was the only one that listed LinkedIn as his most used and favorite social media network. And part of that, if you're thinking about Logan, is he thought his measure of success in life and worth was related to getting a job and being successful. So he would be on LinkedIn saying, oh, Annie got this internship. What about my internship? Is my internship good enough? So his standard was built around LinkedIn, which was a bit different from all the other students. The other ones were trying to appear like they're having a great time in college. Logan was subject to that too, but the LinkedIn pressure is what changed kind of his approach to this. And so part of it is if you're posting all these things and then you're seeing everyone else's, you're consuming those perfected images, that kind of has that cumulative impact. So Logan, it's what I get, I assume is causing my greatest dissatisfaction at college, seeing my life in comparison to others. Ashley, I definitely think about it more than I should. There was always this recognition of, this isn't good, this doesn't feel right to me, but I can't help it. So like they knew it wasn't great, but they were still subject to it and couldn't seem to fully always move out of it. And so that was part of this kind of aspects of digitized development, and where unhappiness for college students comes out and some of the burnout is in terms of these comparisons. Now, this type of behavior has existed in college students and high school students forever, right? It's not new. Peers and wanting to be part of an in-group. What's different is this kind of always on, always connected nature of your smartphone is it's always right there in your face. And so it's reinforcing in ways that when we didn't have these objects was a little bit different. There is one other thing I want to say related to this, and then we want to just kind of break it out into questions. We'll take question and answer because we have a more abbreviated time together today. And that's how students of different identities experience some of the phenomenon that I talked about. Online communities can be an incredible space for folks, particularly who maybe have minoritized identities that can't find liked people. So for many students, some of the students in my study that fit that description, having validation had a very different take than my majority students. For majority students, the validation was, I'm doing great and I'm successful and I want to demonstrate that. For some of my students with more minoritized identities, it was, how can I find people like me? How can I find spaces that are affirming, because I'm not finding that in the broader community. So there's also a lot more research, and there's some folks that are doing some work in there if you're interested. I would at least want to put that out there because I know I've spoken very broad brushstrokes today. So we just want to open it up then for questions that you may have about either of our research or how they intersect, or maybe there's a student affairs professional in your life that posts photos with students that wants to get validation themselves.
Thank you both. I just wanted to ask, so your research in a way is sort of two ends of a spectrum, I suppose, but speaking for myself and some of my peers, and especially in the work we do and some of like social justice practices, a lot of us engage or tend to engage online about some of the things that that are passionate about or that affect us, and I think sometimes that leads to burnout, but it's also sort of part of our profession and our role in who we are and what we're trying to accomplish. And so I think that intersects in your research, whereas like as staff and grad students, we also engage online in those, connecting sort of ways. And so I just wanted to know if you could talk about like that sort of niche of, and how that affects burnout in that way.
Well, Annie and I were just at CIAHO, and one of the things that someone brought up that we were talking about some of this stuff that we're like, wow, that's a really great point, was someone said, our colleagues that we see that sometimes will post photos with students or at a late night event to kind of almost prove, look, I'm working late at night. I'm committed to students. Here's my students in my photos with me also, that are even sometimes our colleagues are doing some of the student behaviors that I described, while also grappling probably in part with burnout and working late hours, but then using that as a badge, right? Like, look at me, I'm working till midnight tonight. And so you get the validation that you're getting from my study, but you're also getting kind of maybe the potential burnout that you see in what Annie's work, and that we might even fall trapped to some of this stuff in our own lives.
I would say you bring up a really great question, and if you're interested in going back to or going to school to get your doctorate, that is an excellent research topic there. Unfortunately, I can't speak too much to that because I focus specifically on the after-hours text messages, emails, and phone calls, so more of that on-call side of things. But I think you're absolutely right, and I think that the more time we spend on any subject, whether at online or in person, can be exhausting. And so it's important to figure out that balance to help make sure and self-modulate that you're not burning out, and what you can do to take care of yourself. Like Anderson Cooper said yesterday, do what you need to do so that you can keep feeling, so that we can keep doing that kind of work for our students. So I think you're onto something, and I would love to see the data published at some point in the future.
I think the other thing is, I mentioned that adults are subject to some of this behavior too, right? That part of it's developmental, but I think part of it's where you're situated. So if my values aren't in alignment at my institution and I'm not feeling value in the place that I'm working, I'm going to try to seek it out elsewhere. So how am I going to seek it out elsewhere? I might go online to try to post things so I get the validation externally so that I feel is better in my job. So there can be some relationships too between I'm feeling burnt out, and so I'm going to exhibit these behaviors because I need the external validation right now because I need to get it from somewhere, and I'm not getting it from my job. And there, yeah.
Hi. I was just wondering if in your research you found that there were any particular areas of student affairs that experienced more burnout than others, and if so, what recommendations you made for those areas.
Sure. So I would say hold on, because we're going to get to that in our implications for research. So excellent question. Also, I think those that serve in an on-call capacity experience burnout at a higher level due to the lack of control of when those phone calls and things occur for them. Thinking through really fast, that's a lot of data going through my head. That's the only one that comes to mind. There is implications for future research that we need to do a better job of looking at both different institution types, different position types needs to be broken down a little bit more than what I was able to do in my research. And we'll talk about some other pieces too, but definitely that on-call piece adds a little bit to that. And so those of us that supervise or work with staff that are on call need to pay attention to those types of things so that we can build flexible schedules for those who are on call, so that we can do some creative things with the work schedule to help those staff members feel like they have more control over their work, even though we still need them to fill that on-call responsibility for the safety and security of our students.
And I'll put a plug in. I'm on a panel that's going to be tomorrow. It's called Not Working 9 to 5, Alternative Work Arrangements. So I'm going to be on that panel. We're going to talk about a whole gamut of basically ways to alternatively, schedule yourself, meaning you don't come in at 9, you come in at 10, but you work later. So different hours, or remote work, or job sharing where two people are sharing the same job, and kind of all the spectrum of different outside the 9 to 5 norm ways of organizing work. So if you're interested in that, that might also have some import for you as well. So.
Thank you. So I work in marketing our student affairs programs and engaging our students and letting them know about all of the services and programs that we offer. And so naturally, we're following the trend of other marketers, which is moving away from print into digital. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about the responsibility of administrators to kind of capitalize on that and kind of push towards something that may not be in the best interest of students ultimately.
That's a great question. Because I think sometimes I've spoken about marketing, more of a marketing angle to college students before, and certainly if you look at the research and what motivates them, that will give you some clues as to how you can market them, right? So if you know that your students are externally defined and need to show these idolized pictures, what do you do during orientation? You create frames that have the school's name on it, and you've got a pretty building in the background. I worked at Boston College, so it'd be Gaston Hall for me. And so you play into that a little bit because you know that's important. And so, I think with marketing, you want to do that in part to get your message out earlier, but and better. But you also have to think about how are we educating students to move away from kind of this external validation piece. There's a few institutions that are playing with some of this stuff, have social media weeks. Do things during orientation, talk about digital reputation. Rutgers is one of them. University of Cincinnati is another. Bridgewater State has done some work with this, and they're popping up in more and more institutions. So every now and then I go out and look, and I keep seeing more of this. But they'll have social media week, and so they'll pull in all the aspects of the institution. They'll have career services come in and talk about it from how do you get a job. How do you worry about your reputation in terms of when employers look through your social media profiles when you apply for a job, to getting a great headshot so you have something to put up there, to how do you actually use these tools to collaborate, and also then kind of weds in some of the marketing piece, because the more that social becomes a fabric of something, it fits into a lot of different jobs, right? Like marketing is probably more of a shared student affairs responsibility than it ever was before. In part because we all have a goal of that. So there are educational outcomes. If you're interested in some of those outcomes, I'd look at ISTE, I-S-T-E, International Society for Technology and Education. They have standards for students that they should learn before they leave high school, actually, but I don't know that all high schools are hitting those outcomes, and that's as close as you can get to college level outcomes that I found out there. And they'll say things like, how do you promote digital citizenship? How do you promote digital collaborators and things like that? And that can kind of help you look at the marketing aspect, but then also see what is some of the educational aspect that maybe we need to do too. So that's a great question.
I think too, I'm going to put a disclaimer. I don't like to put students in generational boxes, but at the same time, as we put them in generational boxes, we can help better understand from a marketing perspective. And so as we look at the next generation coming up, I think that we'll be able to get their attention via the online social media marketing side of things, but they're going to want the follow-up face-to-face. They're going to want to know the human being behind it. And I think that's going to start to shift our marketing and how we go after students as more and more of them enter our institutions. Because right now there are first years some, there are second years some, so they're not in mass quite yet. But I think if we pay attention to that generational literature, we'll start to see that will be a little bit different and might shift that technique just a little bit.
Because really, even if you're not looking at it from a strict generational perspective, age matters when it comes to this piece, because there is a big difference between what age you are and what you're using, kind of a thing.
So you both talked a little bit about the progression from external validation to internal validation, and how, as students become more comfortable and confident, that it tends to go toward that internal validation. I'm teaching a course this semester about, it's called Intro to Adulting for seniors, and so teaching them about real world things and what it's going to be like out there. And so I wonder if you could talk, if there's any research about what happens in that first job when they graduate, they move away from their friends, they move out of the residence halls. I have a feeling that the pendulum swings back toward that external validation again when they see their friends doing all these other things. And of course, we know that that track isn't linear, but I wonder if there's any research about kind of that first job, that first couple years out of college.
Part of that, I think, relates to, of course, think of Nancy Schlossberg, and you think of transitions, and you think of kind of that, almost developmental pattern of, you're making some progress, but you kind of loop back, that kind of retrograde a little bit. I had one student in my study who had just graduated. She was a graduate student, so she was just fresh out. And it's funny that you mentioned adulting, because that's the word she used. And she said, well, today I made a sandwich, right? And I decided to take a picture of it because I wanted to show people, like, hey, I can adult. I'm adulting right now. Look at what I did. I made my own lunch on my own today, because normally I would have eaten in the dining hall for the past 4 years. And so she said she noticed she was exhibiting behaviors that she had when she was a first-year student. Now, she wasn't as beholden to it, and it didn't mess with her psyche as much when she did it. But she did say, when all my friends dispersed out and I don't see them on a daily basis, this is now how I'm connecting with them. And I want to show them that, hey, I've got this adult thing down on lock, right? I made my lunch today. So there is that aspect of it going in there. And I think if we look at our new staff, related to being on duty at a level probably they hadn't been on duty yet before, and needing that validation, having previously worked in residence life, I know that with our new hall directors, I would spend a lot of time reassuring them on that first crisis response call, or the first few, just to, you're fine, you're doing it, you know how to do it. So they need that validation even themselves, I think, in part, and to make sure they feel like they're doing their job. That's it? Yeah. Mic drop? Okay. So yeah, so, I that's something, if I was teaching that class, I would prepare them for. Reflect on how it was when you last had your big transition. What's it going to be like coming up into this current transition? And what are some of the behaviors, and do you see that? And do you want it to be different this time? What have you learned? What have you transformed in a way that's different? So, other questions? Yes, let me get over there.
So I work full-time in social media marketing for my institution. And so I've had to do a lot of self-care around all of the proliferation of political news that is constantly on my dashboard as I'm, doing my work. And so I'm curious to know what the impact of political news, fake or not, has been on students that you spoke to in terms of their burnout, or staff as well.
Well, if you work in social media marketing, you know that social media and technology moves very quickly, right? So as soon as my dissertation was published, the election happened, and it was completely invalid after that, right? I did a majority of my research before kind of the electoral period kind of ramped up in full force. So even when I'm giving talks like this, I'm cognizant of some of the stuff I had previously presented. I just look at differently than I did prior to November. And I think part of it is, and students are pretty astute about this, and because it came up a little bit in my research, is well, it actually really came up in Adam Gismondi's research. So Adam Gismondi is here at the conference, and I know that he's presenting. There was a pre-con that they did related to bias incidents and being on social media. There is a tendency for avoidance of civil debate amongst college students that are at a developmental period where they see conflict and they step away from it. And so what he found is when there's all this rancor and things like that, the natural impulse from most of them would be to disengage or to stay away from it. Some of them that would be from the standpoint of they recognize, hey, this is not a medium where you're going to get a lot of work done. Like even if you are passionate about something, you want to do some activism, arguing with your uncle on Facebook is probably not really going to move the needle on anything. So what's the point? And so for students, they recognize that and either they'd avoid it, which is their usual strategy, or they just disengage from it entirely because it's an intimidating environment, right? Because you have to come out, you have to state an opinion about something, and then you have to try to back it up, and you're going to get challenged about it, which for students starting off their college career, that's really intimidating, right? And you become more comfortable with it over time. So I would say that as an educator, the way I approach it is teach students, if you want to engage in activism or you want to engage in these issues, what are the appropriate venues for do that? What are your goals for doing that? What are the platforms then that should drive that? Ask those questions first, because what I found is, and students generally seem to get this, younger students seem to get this better than older adults do, arguing with someone on Facebook isn't really activism. Organizing people on Twitter to go out to protest to something and then sharing information and then figuring out what the hashtag is going to be so that you can, getting a community developed organically and things like that is more activist. So part of it is we all know where old people like to spend their social media time. Facebook. Younger people aren't moving towards Facebook. They're using these other tools. So they're more astute into how can I use some of these tools to, act, get my information or things like that than older folks are who are just using Facebook only. They're using a lot more different kinds of sources that privilege different kinds of actions in terms of the things that you can do. So. All right. Well, shall we wrap up with some implications for practice? I think so. I think you're up to bat first, right?
Yeah. Clicker. Oh, yeah. Thanks. All right. So going back to one of our earlier questions, some implications for research. Where you work matters. That goes back to the values conversation that we had earlier. If your values are misaligned, you're going to be unhappy in the work that you're doing. So make sure that if you're searching or when you're ready to search, that you really do take the time to do that self-work to understand where your values are and understand the institutions that you're applying for, what their values are, and making sure there's a good alignment there. Also, control matters. We talked about that earlier too. So the ability to have control over your work is very important. And so you want to ask questions about oh my gosh, let's take a step back. You want to ask questions about potential new supervisors or even with current supervisors, how you can have a little bit more control over your work. Now, some will say you can absolutely have control over your work as long as you do it my way, this way, step A, B, C, D, E, F, G, 25,000. And that may work for you. I'm one that needs I need broad guidelines that I can then just color and draw whatever picture I want in the middle as long as I'm meeting the end expectation that I'm happy. And so that's the type of environment that I need. If you need a more structured environment and that allows you to feel more control over your work, then you want to make sure that you're looking for an environment like that. Or working with your current supervisor to create an environment like that so that your expectations are the same. Also, we need to explore all the gender differences. So in my study, I was able to capture male-female data, but we didn't go into all of the other gender identities that could be out there. And so somebody who's looking for a dissertation topic, take burnout in student affairs and look at it from the variety of different genders that present in our work. And are there different types that burn out at higher rates than others? I don't know, but that would be good research to have in the future. Also, all the different family statuses that exist out there. The single mom working really hard with a 5-year-old at home, trying to make everything work for the students that she cares really a lot about and her own child that she cares a lot about may burn out differently than someone like me who has a husband who's amazing and a father who lives with me that can take my 5-year-old in a minute, right? That's very different. And so I think that future research can help by adding in some data on that gap that exists about the different family types that we have that exist in student affairs and burnout. Also, we need to explore different institution types and positions. I did a broad stroke of student affairs in general, but I think if you break it down by institutional type, funding type, different position types, that you're going to find some different nuances in who burns out more likely and why. And so again, if you're looking for a good dissertation topic, I'm giving you 8 of them. It's going to be wonderful. Take one.
And so part of, I think, a summative kind of notion that applies to both of ours really is how can we learn to own rather than be owned by the technology, right? How can we make it work for what we needed to do rather than being subject to it and it kind of dictates, oh, this is how you should act, or you need to have this paranoia about needing to answer the phone, and I'm going to structure my whole life around the technology. And so I mentioned this earlier. This is when I talked about the ISTE standards. There they are up on the right. At least the broad categories of that. But you can download the entire packet of those. I think developing tech competencies within our students and then, of course, within ourselves. So there's the visual representation of the ACPA, NASPA technology competency and other competencies for us as professionals is something that we've come a long way with, and I think we still need some work to do. Because the more that we're competent in some of these things, the better we're able to help our students navigate it through there. It's okay, even advised, to take a break from technology from occasion, right? So I mentioned I had a couple Catholic students that gave up technology for Lent, or another student that took a break for finals. I never even thought to originally ask, hey, have you ever taken a break from technology in my research study? But one of my dissertation committee members says, ask them about that, see what they say. How often do they do it? How long did it take? All of them did, every single one of them, and all of them reported it was actually a very positive behavior because they started to do things and exhibit behaviors, and they didn't even realize they were doing it. So once they took a break from it, it allowed them to reset their relationship with their technology and come back in with a new set of routines and behaviors. And I've even known that in myself. You might even see it within yourself. Sometimes you just start doing things on technology, and then you're like, wait a minute, why am I spending so much time doing this every day? Why is this important to my life? So taking the break can sometimes help reset that kind of relationship. Being vulnerable, in part, when it comes to, in my case, the social media use amongst college students, but being okay with being vulnerable. Most of folks' struggles online related to vulnerability. Some people use the word authentic. I don't totally love the use of that word. I prefer the term vulnerable because I think authentic seems to mean there is one true self, and we know that we're made up of a lot of different identities. So I think being vulnerable is how can I show parts of myself and feel comfortable doing that. And knowing that sometimes there's policing of that and what goes into where you can do that. And the other piece, one of the final pieces is really just learn from each other about these tools. One thing that I usually say is, students are the experts in how to use the technology tool, or at least how it functions. I don't know that they always use it intelligently or towards purpose-driven ends, but they know how it works. Older people know usually a little bit more about life and how to fit certain things into your goals and wants and needs, but they may not possess the ability to know how to use Snapchat because it's a confusing interface. So how can we teach each other and kind of come to the middle and navigate that and doing it? Because neither of us possesses all the knowledge and neither of us knows all the answers to how this works. And so that's how it relates to really just being a good partner, either be it from colleague to colleague as it relates to stress that we deal with at work, or being good learning partners between educators and students. So that is what we wanted to share with you today. I know that we do have some resources still available on the web, or if you want to access the inventory, you didn't get a paper copy but want to access that, you can contact Annie. We use very simple addresses, so pretty much our names.com. So you can access us later. So thank you for coming, and have a great rest of your conference.